My parents threw me a graduation party, and in front of 60 guests, my father stood up to make a toast. But instead of congratulating me, he raised his glass and announced that I was an ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on the family, and asked everyone to drink to the hope that I would one day come to my senses. The room went silent. I was 22 years old. I had just put myself through college with no help from them, working 2 jobs the entire time. And I was, at that exact moment, still paying off a loan I had taken out to cover my little brother's tuition, a loan my parents had begged me for and promised in writing to repay. I had the paperwork in my bag, and I stood up. This is the story of the night I stopped being my family's bank, and it is only the first of many because after I shared it, hundreds of people wrote to me about their own entitled parents, and their stories are the ones you're going to hear tonight. Settle in. This is a long one, and every story in it is about the same thing. A parent who decided a child was not a person to love, but a resource to use, and the quiet proof that finally set the record straight. My name is Rachel, and to understand that graduation party, you have to understand the family I grew up in. In some families, love is unconditional. In mine, love was a transaction, and I was always paying. My younger brother, Tyler, was the golden child, the one whose every want was met, whose every failure was excused, whose comfort was the entire point of my parents' lives. And I was the other kind of child, the reliable one, the useful one, the one expected to give and never need anything back, because in my family, needing something was a privilege reserved for Tyler. I learned this early. When we were kids, Tyler got the new clothes, the lessons, the trips, the birthday parties. I got the hand-me-downs and a lecture about not being greedy whenever I asked for anything at all. When it came time for college, my parents paid Tyler's way completely, tuition and apartment spending money, because Tyler was finding himself. When it was my turn 2 years earlier, I was told the money simply wasn't there, and that I'd have to figure it out myself. So I did. I worked through school, took loans, lived on almost nothing, and graduated with a degree I had paid for entirely alone, while my parents wrote check after check for the son they actually loved. I made my peace with that, or I told myself I had. But here is the thing about being the family resource. The demands never stop, they only grow. Because a year before my graduation, my parents came to me with a request that would become the center of this whole story. Tyler, it turned out, had a gap in his tuition funding. My parents had, through their usual mismanagement and overspending, run short, and Tyler's next semester was at risk. And so they came to me, their working, self-supporting daughter, and they asked me to take out a loan to cover it. They framed it as temporary. They promised over and over that they would pay it back, every cent, as soon as they were back on their feet. And because I was the reliable one, and because I could not stand the thought of Tyler dropping out, I did it. I took out a loan in my own name, several $1,000s, and I handed it to my parents for Tyler's tuition. And here is the one thing I did that changed everything, the thing that turns this from a story about being used into a story about being vindicated. I got it in writing. Not because I distrusted my parents, though perhaps I should have, but because I am a careful person and because a loan is a loan. I had them sign a simple written agreement, the amount, the purpose, and their promise to repay me on a schedule. They signed it without hesitation because in their minds it meant nothing, just a formality to placate their anxious daughter. To me it meant everything, though I did not yet know why. They never paid back a cent. Of course they didn't. The months passed, and every time I gently raised the repayment, my parents grew evasive, then annoyed, then eventually hostile. They acted as though my asking for my own money back was a betrayal, an act of greed, proof that I cared more about money than family. And slowly, I watched them begin to rewrite the story, not just to me, but to the extended family. In their version, there was no loan. In their version, I had refused to help my brother during a hard time. In their version, I was the selfish daughter who kept score and made everything about money, while they were the loving parents doing their best for their children. It was a masterful inversion, and it is the same one you will hear in almost every story tonight. The entitled parent takes what you give in private, and then accuses you in public so that you look selfish and they look wronged. And by the time my graduation party came around, my parents had told this story so many times, to so many relatives, that half the room believed I was the ungrateful one. That is why my father felt safe standing up to make that toast. He believed the ground had been prepared. He believed I would sit there, humiliated and silent the way I always had, because the resource does not talk back. He was wrong, and here is why. I had spent my whole life being told I was selfish, and I had spent my whole life quietly documenting the truth, because some deep instinct told me that one day I would need it. I had the signed loan agreement. I had the bank records of the loan I'd taken and handed to them. I had the record of my own tuition, paid alone with no help from them. I had, in short, the entire true history of my family's finances, written down and dated, sitting in a folder waiting. So when my father raised his glass and asked 60 people to drink to my coming to my senses, I stood up, and I did not shout, and I did not cry. I said, "Dad, since we're talking about who's been ungrateful to this family, I think everyone here deserves the full picture." And I took the folder out of my bag. 2 years ago, I said to the whole room, Mom and Dad told me there was no money for my college, so I paid for it myself, working 2 jobs with loans I'm still paying off. Here are the records. I laid them on the table. And a year ago, they came to me and asked me to take out another loan in my own name to cover Tyler's tuition because they'd run short. They promised to pay it back. Here is the agreement they signed. I laid it down. Here are their signatures. Here is the loan in my name. I'm still paying it every month right now, tonight at this party. They have never paid back a cent. So when Dad says I turned my back on this family, understand that I am, at this very moment, paying for my brother's education out of my own pocket, on a loan my parents begged me for and signed a promise to repay. The silence in that room was total. My aunt, my mother's own sister, picked up the signed agreement and read it. And her face changed. And she said quietly, "Diane, is this true? Did Rachel take out a loan for Tyler's school?" And my mother could not answer because the answer was yes, and the proof was on the table, and there were 60 witnesses. The story my parents had spent a year building collapsed in about 90 seconds. Because a tearful accusation is persuasive right up until the moment someone lays a signed contract on the table, and then it is nothing at all. The relatives who had come to that party believing I was the ungrateful daughter left knowing exactly who I was, and exactly what my parents had done. My father never finished his toast. My mother spent the rest of the evening in the kitchen. And I, for the first time in my life, felt the particular peace that comes from watching the truth, which you have carried alone for so long, finally set down in front of. If you love stories like this, follow for more. I appreciate your support. Everyone at once. My parents never apologized. People like them don't. But they also never again told the story of the ungrateful daughter, because the folder had ended it. And I stopped that night being the family bank. I set boundaries. I protected my own money and my own life. Tyler, to his credit, called me a few weeks later, genuinely shaken, and said he hadn't known about the loan, that he'd always been told I was difficult, and that he was beginning to understand that none of it had been true. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. The lesson I carry, and the thread through every story you're about to hear, is this. Entitled parents survive on one trick above all others. They keep the giving invisible and the refusals visible. They take everything you give in private, and they broadcast the one time you finally said no so that you look selfish and they look wronged. The thing that breaks the trick is the record. The signed agreement. The bank statement. The dated proof of what you actually gave. Not to keep score for its own sake, but because on the day they try to make you the villain in a story where you were the hero, the truth in your hand is the only thing that can turn it around. I paid for my brother's college on a loan my parents begged me for, and let them call me ungrateful for a year, until the night the signatures finally spoke for me. So settle in, because what follows are many more stories like mine, from people who each grew up as the resource in a family that should have seen them as a child, and who each, in the end, found that the quiet truth they had kept was stronger than the loudest, most tearful lie. The first story after mine came from a woman named Monica, whose entitled parents did not just use her, they stole her very name. Monica was, like me, the reliable child in a family with a favored sibling, a younger brother who could do no wrong. Monica had worked hard, built good credit, lived responsibly, and her parents, who lived beyond their means, viewed her stability as a shared family asset. Over the years, they had pressured her into co-signing things, into lending money, into helping out, always with guilt. But then Monica started getting calls from collection agencies about debts she had never taken on, credit accounts she had never opened. And as she investigated, the horror unfolded. Her parents had been opening credit cards and accounts in her name, without her knowledge, using her good credit as their own private reserve, running up thousands in debt they had no intention of repaying. When the accounts went unpaid, the damage landed on Monica, whose name was on them. Her own parents had committed identity theft against her for years. When Monica confronted them, they did not apologize. They minimized. "You're our daughter, what's yours is ours." They deflected. "We were going to pay it back." And when Monica did not accept that, they went on the offensive, telling the extended family that Monica was threatening her own parents over money, that she was cold and ungrateful, the same inversion my parents used. But Monica, once the shock passed, did what the survivors always do. She gathered the paper. She pulled her full credit reports and identified every fraudulent account, with the dates each was opened, provably by her parents, many while she was living elsewhere. She filed a formal identity theft report, the real legal kind, and she assembled a complete, dated record of exactly what had been opened in her name, when and by whom. Monica told me, "My parents thought my good name was theirs to spend. They counted on me never checking because a good daughter trusts her parents. Now I check everything and keep everything. And that's what actually protects me." not trust. Records. When a relative repeated her parents' line that Monica was attacking them over a misunderstanding, Monica sent that relative the credit report, and the paper made the truth undeniable, and the family's sympathy moved to where it belonged. The next story came from a woman named Priya, whose entitled parents tried to steal a lifetime of money meant for her, an inheritance from her grandmother. Priya's grandmother, who had loved her dearly and knew she was overlooked, had left Priya a meaningful inheritance, specifically to Priya, in a clearly written will. But Priya's parents believed that anything belonging to their child belonged, really, to them, and they set about trying to take it. First, they pressured Priya directly to share it with the family, guilt-tripping her about selfishness. When that didn't work, they claimed that the grandmother had really wanted the money divided among everyone, that Priya was twisting the will, that Priya was stealing from the family by keeping what had been left to her. They told relatives Priya was greedy, that she'd manipulated a dying woman. But Priya had the will, the actual legal dated document, clearly leaving the inheritance to her specifically. So when her parents spread the story that Priya was stealing from the family, Priya shared the will itself, the clear legal document in her grandmother's own wishes. Priya told me, "My parents told everyone I was stealing my grandmother's money, but my grandmother wrote down exactly who it was for, and it was for me. The will didn't care what my parents claimed. It said my name." Priya kept her inheritance, honored her grandmother's wishes, and used the money for exactly what her grandmother had wanted, Priya's own future. The next story came from a woman named Nadia, whose entitled parents tried to charge her for the childhood they gave her. When Nadia became a successful adult, her parents, who had favored her brother her whole life, decided she now owed them for the cost of raising her. They presented her seriously with a demand for repayment, a running tally of what they claimed they'd spent on her childhood, food, clothes, school, and they wanted it back in cash, framed as her debt to them for being born and raised. Meanwhile, her brother, who had cost them far more and given back nothing, owed nothing. When Nadia refused to pay her parents for having been their child, they told the family she was ungrateful and thought she was too good for them. But Nadia kept the demand because her parents had, incredibly, put it in writing, an itemized list of childhood expenses they wanted reimbursed like an invoice for existing. When the family began repeating that Nadia refused to give back to her parents, Nadia simply shared the document. Nadia told me, "They literally billed me for raising me in writing and then told everyone I was the ungrateful one. All I had to do was show people the invoice. Nobody thought I was ungrateful after they read it." The demand died in the light, and Nadia never paid a cent for the crime of having been born. The next story came from a woman named Grace, whose entitled parents stole from her before she was old enough to stop them. When Grace was a teenager, she'd done professional work, modeling and acting, that had earned real money, legally supposed to be held for her until she came of age. Her parents controlled that money as her guardians, and when Grace turned 18 and asked about it, she was told it was gone, spent on the family, which really meant spent on her brother and on her parents' lifestyle. Years of her earnings, money the law said was hers, had been quietly drained by the people trusted to protect it. When Grace, as an adult, pressed the issue, her parents told the family she was obsessed with money, accusing her own parents of stealing, tearing the family apart over the past. But Grace gathered the records, the documentation of what she'd earned as a minor, the accounts that had held it, the withdrawals that had emptied it, and where the law stood on a guardian who drains a child's protected earnings. Grace told me, "They spent the money I earned as a kid and then called me greedy for asking where it went. But I had the earning records in the account history. The withdrawals were right there, in their names from my account." The paper told the story they didn't want told. The family understood, and Grace, though she never fully recovered the money, recovered the truth, believed at last. The next story came from a woman named Lauren, whose entitled parents used her as free labor and then accused her of neglect. Lauren was the family's designated helper, and whenever her golden child brother and his wife needed childcare, it was Lauren who was volunteered for free endlessly to raise her brother's children while he and his wife lived their lives. Lauren loved her niece and nephew, so she did it, for years unpaid, giving up her own time and opportunities. And it was never enough. Then, when Lauren finally began setting limits, taking a demanding new job and reducing her free babysitting, her parents turned on her, telling the family that Lauren had abandoned her niece and nephew, that she only cared about herself. But Lauren had the record, years of texts and messages arranging the endless free childcare, showing exactly how much she'd done, and showing that her recent abandonment was simply her taking a job and asking for reasonable limits. Lauren told me, "They used me as a free nanny for years, and the moment I got a job they told everyone I abandoned the kids. But I had years of messages showing everything I'd done. The truth was I'd given more than anyone, not less." The family saw the record, and the guilt they'd tried to load onto Lauren fell away. The next story came from a man named Sam, whose entitled parents turned a gift into a weapon. When Sam bought his first home, his parents contributed to the down payment, and at the time they called it a gift, warmly, generously. Sam, being careful, had it documented properly, as gifts for a mortgage must be, with a signed gift letter stating clearly that the money was a gift, not a loan. Years later, when Sam and his parents had a falling out because Sam had declined some new demand, his parents suddenly reframed the gift as a loan and demanded he repay it, with interest, immediately, telling the family that Sam had taken their money and refused to pay it back, that he was a freeloader. But Sam had the gift letter, the signed, dated document, in their own hand, calling the money a gift. Sam told me, "They gave me the money as a gift in writing and years later called it a loan I refused to repay. But I had the signed gift letter. Their own signatures said gift. The paper protected me from their rewrite." Sam kept his home, and his parents' attempt to weaponize their own generosity failed against the document they'd signed. The next story came from a man named Ben, whose entitled parents denied a promise they'd made in writing. Ben's parents had, for years, promised him a specific fund for his education, and unlike many such promises, this one had been put in writing, in cards, in messages, even in a small formal savings arrangement. Ben had planned his life around it. But when the time came, the money wasn't there, because his parents had redirected it to his golden child sister's far more expensive pursuits. And rather than admit this, they simply denied the fund had ever existed, told Ben he'd imagined the promise, that he was entitled for expecting his parents to pay for his education. But Ben had kept the evidence, the written promises, the cards mentioning the education fund, the messages referencing it, records of the savings arrangement before it was drained. Ben told me. They spent my education fund on my sister and then told me it never existed, that I'd made it up. But I had their own written words promising it going back years. They couldn't tell me I imagined something they'd put in writing. The family saw the proof, and Ben, though the money was gone, was at last believed about what he'd been promised. The next story came from a woman named Talia, whose entitled parents tried to destroy her marriage because they could no longer control her. When Talia married a good man named Josh, her parents lost the grip they'd always had on her, and rather than accept it, they set out to break the marriage. They began telling Josh things about Talia, private things twisted into lies, claiming she'd said cruel things about him, inventing a version of Talia designed to poison his trust. And to Talia, they told lies about Josh. When it didn't work, they told the extended family that Josh had isolated Talia, casting the husband as a villain. But Talia and Josh talked to each other, and they kept the messages. When Josh started hearing strange things, he showed Talia. When Talia heard lies about Josh, she checked them against him, and they discovered the whole campaign documented in her parents' own messages. Talia told me, "My parents tried to break up my marriage with lies, then told everyone my husband isolated me. But Josh and I kept everything and compared notes. Their own messages proved they were the ones lying. The truth was in writing. The marriage survived stronger, and the family saw who the real saboteurs had been." The next story came from a man named Marcus, whose entitled parents decided his home was theirs. Marcus had bought a house entirely on his own in his own name. But his parents, operating on the belief that a child's property is really the family's, decided that Marcus's spare room should house his golden child brother, rent-free indefinitely, and began treating the home as family property to allocate as they saw fit. When Marcus said no, they were outraged and told the family that Marcus was selfish, that he had all that space and wouldn't help his own brother, implying they'd helped him buy it, which they had not. But Marcus had the deed, the house in his name alone, bought with his own money. Marcus told me, "They treated my house like family property to hand out, and told everyone I was selfish for saying no. But the deed had one name on it. Mine. I bought it alone. The paper settled who it actually belonged to." Marcus kept his home and his boundaries, and his parents learned that ownership is a matter of record, not of family opinion. The next story came from a woman named Hannah, whose entitled parents manufactured an emergency to extract money. Hannah's parents called her in a panic one day with a medical emergency, a frightening story about a sudden health crisis requiring thousands of dollars immediately. Hannah, terrified, sent the money at once. But something nagged at her afterward because there were no bills, no recovery, and because this was not the first emergency that had drained her. So Hannah gently asked for the medical documentation, and there was none because there had been no medical emergency. The money, she learned, had gone toward a luxury vacation for her parents and her golden child sibling. When Hannah confronted them, they told the family Hannah was keeping score, heartless for questioning her own parents. But Hannah had the record, the panicked messages describing the fake emergency, the transfer she'd made, and the evidence that the money's timing matched a lavish family trip she hadn't been invited to. Hannah told me, "They invented a medical emergency to get money out of me, and spent it on a vacation with my sibling. But I had the panicked messages in the timeline. The story they told me didn't match where the money went. The dates gave them away. Hannah stopped funding emergencies. And her parents' most reliable trick stopped working. The next story came from a man named Diego, who was the sole caregiver for his dying grandfather while his entitled parents did nothing, and who was then accused of neglect. Diego's grandfather grew ill, and it was Diego, the overlooked grandchild, who stepped up, driving him to appointments, managing his medications, sitting with him through long afternoons, handling everything, while Diego's parents and golden child sibling visited occasionally and did nothing of substance. When his grandfather passed and questions arose about the estate and the care, Diego's parents, eager to control the narrative and the inheritance, told the family that Diego had neglected his grandfather, that he'd barely been around, that he'd only cared about the money. But Diego had documented everything, not out of suspicion, but out of necessity, managing a complex care schedule. He had the calendar of every visit, the records of every appointment he'd driven to, the pharmacy pickups in his name, the daily log of care, dozens upon dozens of entries. Diego told me, "They did nothing for my grandfather, and after he died they told everyone I'd neglected him. But I had the whole care record, every visit, every appointment, every pill. The calendar proved I was there every day and they weren't. The truth was undeniable. The family saw who had actually cared for the old man, and Diego's grief was freed from the insult of a lie." The next story came from a woman named Rosa, whose entitled parents treated her paycheck as their own. From the moment Rosa started earning, her parents demanded a family contribution from every paycheck, an amount that started reasonable and grew year after year, until Rosa was handing over a huge portion of her income while her golden child brother contributed nothing and received plenty. Rosa complied for years out of guilt. Then when she finally reduced the amount to something sustainable so she could build her own life, her parents told the family that Rosa never helped them, that she was selfish, that she'd left them with nothing. But Rosa had every transfer, years of payments to her parents, dated, totaling an amount that stunned even her when she added it up. Rosa told me, "They took a chunk of my salary for years, and when I finally kept a little more for myself, they told everyone I never helped. But I had every transfer. The total was enormous. You can't say someone never helped when there are years of payments with their name on them." The family saw the truth, and Rosa kept her paycheck and her self-respect. The next story came from a woman named Aisha, whose entitled parents tried to hold her whole future hostage. Aisha was offered a life-changing opportunity, a career-making position that required her to move away. Her parents, who expected her to remain nearby forever as their caretaker, delivered an ultimatum: give up the opportunity and stay, or be considered to have abandoned the family. Aisha, heartbroken, tried to compromise, offering to stay closely involved, to visit often, to help from a distance. Her parents refused any middle ground, and when she took the opportunity, told everyone that Aisha had abandoned them, had chosen a job over her family. But Aisha had the messages, the record showing she'd offered every compromise, and that her parents had issued an ultimatum and rejected every olive branch. Aisha told me, "They gave me an ultimatum, and when I chose my future while offering to stay close, they told everyone I abandoned them. But I had the messages where I bent over backwards and they refused. The truth was they cut me off for not obeying, not the other way around." Aisha built her career, and the family understood who had really walked away. The next story came from a man named Priya, whose entitled parents flipped a loan upside down. Priya had, over time, lent his parents a substantial sum, documented with a clear written agreement and a repayment plan, because Priya was careful and his parents had insisted they'd pay it back. They never did. And when Priya eventually, gently, asked about repayment, his parents exploded, and then went to the family with an astonishing claim that Priya actually owed them money, that he was a greedy son hounding his poor parents over debts he'd invented. But Priya had the loan agreement, the written signed record of exactly what he'd lent and the repayment terms his parents had agreed to. Priya told me, "They borrowed a large sum from me in writing, never paid it back, and then told everyone I owed them and was shaking them down. But I had the signed loan agreement. Their own signatures proved who owed whom. The paper flipped their lie right over." The family saw the truth, and Priya never again had to be the villain in a debt he was actually owed. The next story came from a man named Omar, whose entitled parents demanded he sink himself to save his golden child brother. The brother's business was failing, drowning in debt of his own making, and Omar's parents insisted that Omar bail him out, tens of thousands of dollars, because family helps family. What they conveniently forgot was that Omar had already, over the years, given his brother money again and again, none of it ever repaid, all of it wasted. When Omar finally declined to throw good money after bad, his parents told the whole family that Omar had let his own brother go under, that he was heartless. But Omar had the record, years of transfers to his brother, loan after loan, none repaid, documented, dated. Omar told me, "They told everyone I let my brother go under. But I'd bailed him out over and over for years, all documented, never paid back. The record showed I'd already given more than anyone. I didn't abandon him. I finally stopped enabling him." The family saw the truth, and Omar kept the savings that his brother would only have burned. The next story came from a woman named Nina, whose entitled parents erased what she paid. When Nina's grandmother passed, it was Nina who quietly covered the funeral costs, a significant sum, because her parents claimed they couldn't and her golden child sibling offered nothing. Nina paid without fanfare to give her grandmother a proper farewell. But afterward, when the family spoke of who had stepped up, Nina's parents credited the golden child sibling, telling everyone that the sibling had taken care of everything, while Nina had done nothing. But Nina had the receipts, every payment for the funeral in her name, dated, the invoices, the transfers. Nina told me, "They gave my sibling credit for the funeral I paid for, and told everyone I did nothing. But I had every receipt, all in my name. You can't erase what someone paid when the invoices have their name on them. The receipts gave me back the truth." The family learned who had actually honored their grandmother, and Nina's quiet generosity was at last seen. The next story came from a woman named Yuki, whose entitled parents gave her a gift, and then took it back as punishment. When Yuki graduated, her parents gave her a car, titled in her name, hers to keep. But that car came with invisible strings, and when Yuki eventually set a boundary her parents didn't like, they retaliated by showing up, taking the car, and declaring it had always been theirs. They told the family that Yuki was ungrateful and had no right to the car. But the car was titled in Yuki's name, legally hers. Yuki told me. They gave me a car, put it in my name, and then took it back to punish me and told everyone it was theirs. But the title had my name on it. Their anger didn't change the paperwork. The title said it was mine. Yuki recovered her car and learned that a gift with a name on the paperwork is protected by that paperwork, whatever her parents chose to claim. The next story came from a woman named Farah, whose entitled parents turned a gift into an accusation of theft. Farah's parents had given her a piece of family jewelry, a meaningful heirloom, presented warmly as hers. Years later, when they wanted to give it instead to the golden child sibling, they demanded it back, and when Farah was reluctant, they told the family that Farah had stolen the heirloom, that she'd taken it without permission. But Farah had proof it was a gift, a card, a message, the record of it being given to her, in her parents' own warm words at the time. Farah told me, "They gave me the heirloom as a gift, and years later when they wanted it from my sibling, they told everyone I stole it. But I had the card where they gave it to me. Their own words called it a gift. You can't steal what was given to you in writing." Farah kept the heirloom, and the family saw that the only dishonesty had come from the accusers. The next story came from a woman named Sanaa, whose entitled parents raided the savings she'd earned herself. Sanaa had, as a teenager, worked and saved money into an account that her parents were custodians of while she was a minor, and they drained it, spending Sanaa's own hard-earned savings on themselves, and when Sanaa came of age and found the account empty, they claimed the money had been spent on Sanaa, on her care and expenses, and that Sanaa was greedy and ungrateful for questioning it. But the account had a full transaction history, every deposit Sanaa had made from her own work, and every withdrawal her parents had taken. Sanaa told me, "She emptied the savings I'd earned myself as a teenager and said she'd spent it on me, and I was ungrateful to ask. But every deposit and withdrawal was in the account history. The record showed it was my money, and it went to them, not me. The transactions didn't lie." Sanaa was believed, and her parents' claim to have spent a child's earnings on the child's behalf was disproven by the account itself. The next story came from a man named Elias, whose entitled parents tried to shrink his inheritance with a lie. When Elias's father died, his stepmother wanted to reduce Elias's share, and she claimed to the family and the probate process that Elias had already received his inheritance in advance, a large sum supposedly given to him while his father was alive, which should therefore be deducted. It was a complete fabrication, but if believed, it would cut Elias's rightful share dramatically. But Elias had his financial records, and the truth was that no such advance had ever been given, no transfer, no gift, no record of the large sum she claimed. Elias told me, "She told the court and the family I'd already gotten my inheritance in advance, to cut my real share. But no such money ever existed. My financial records showed no gift because there wasn't one, and she couldn't produce proof of something that never happened. The absence of the transfer was the proof." Elias received his full rightful share, because the money she invented left no trace. The next story came from a woman named Layla, whose entitled parents ran up bills in her name. Layla's parents, while she was young and trusting, had put utilities and a phone plan in Layla's name to help build her credit, and then simply stopped paying them, leaving Layla with debts and a damaged credit score for services her parents had used. When Layla discovered it and asked them to pay, They told the family she was attacking her parents over a few bills and making a big deal out of nothing. But Layla had the records, the accounts in her name, the charges her parents had run up, the payments they'd failed to make. Layla told me, "They put utilities and a phone plan in my name and stuck me with the bills for services they used. When I asked them to pay, they said I was making a big deal out of nothing. But I had the accounts and the charges all in my name, all used by them. The record showed exactly whose debts they really were." Layla cleared her name with the documentation, and her parents' habit of borrowing her identity for their bills was exposed. The next story came from a woman named Nadia, whose entitled parents claimed credit for a success they had nothing to do with and demanded a cut. Nadia had built a small business entirely on her own, with her own savings and work. Once it succeeded, her parents, who had mocked it while it struggled, suddenly claimed they had invested in it, that they had given her the start, that the business was partly theirs, and they demanded a share of the profits, telling the family that Nadia was cutting her own parents out of a company she'd built with their help. But Nadia had the founding records, the business registration in her name alone, the funding all from her own accounts, not a single dollar from her parents. Nadia told me, "They mocked my business while it struggled, then claimed they'd invested in it once it worked and demanded a share, telling everyone I cut them out. But I had every financial document. There was no money from them because there wasn't any. The records showed I built it alone." Nadia kept her business, and her parents' attempt to claim a stake they'd never held collapsed against the ledger. The next story came from a woman named Priyanka, whose entitled parents tried to sabotage her wedding to keep control. Priyanka's parents, resentful that she was building a life beyond them, tried to derail her wedding, spreading lies to her fiancé's family, manufacturing conflicts, threatening not to attend unless the couple submitted to their control over the guest list, the budget, and the plans. When the couple set boundaries, Priyanka's parents told the extended family that Priyanka had cut them out of her own wedding and was ungrateful. But Priyanka had the messages documenting her parents' attempts at control and sabotage, and the reasonable, patient way she and her fiancé had responded. Priyanka told me, "They tried to hijack my wedding and threatened not to come unless they controlled everything, then told the family I cut them out. But I had the messages showing their demands and our reasonable responses. The record showed who was really trying to control the wedding. It wasn't me." The couple married on their own terms, and the family saw the truth behind the parents' complaints. The next story came from a man named Tom, whose entitled parents demanded he give up a settlement that was his. Tom had received a legal settlement, money that was legally and specifically his. His parents, viewing any money in the family as theirs to direct, demanded he share it, hand a large portion to them and the golden child sibling, and when Tom declined money that was rightfully his, they told the family he was selfish and hoarding money that should help the family. But Tom had the documentation of the settlement, clearly and legally his alone. Tom told me, "They demanded I hand over a settlement that was legally mine, and called me selfish for keeping my own money. But the settlement was documented as mine specifically. The paper showed it belonged to me, not the family. Their claim had no ground." Tom kept his settlement, and his parents learned that legally designated money does not become family property on demand. The next story came from a woman named Nadia, whose entitled parents disowned her. then came back for money. When Dahlia set firm boundaries after years of being used, her parents dramatically disowned her, told the whole family she was cut off, cast her out with great public declarations. Years later, when they needed money, they reappeared, expecting Dahlia to support them, and when she was hesitant, they told the family she was abandoning her elderly parents. But Dahlia had the record of the disownment, their own messages and declarations cutting her off, and the history of why the estrangement had happened. Dahlia told me, "They disowned me publicly when I set boundaries, and years later came back demanding money, then told everyone I was abandoning my elderly parents. But I had their own words disowning me. The record showed they cut me off first and only came back when they needed something. The truth was documented." The family saw the whole arc, and Dahlia's parents could not rewrite the disownment they themselves had declared. The next story came from a woman named Fatima, whose entitled parents demanded support while secretly hoarding their own wealth. Fatima's parents pressured her for years to financially support them, claiming poverty, guilt-tripping her about her duty, and Fatima gave, believing they were struggling. But she discovered in time that her parents were not struggling at all, that they had substantial savings and assets they were hiding, while extracting money from their daughter and lavishing it on the golden child. When Fatima raised it, they told the family she was refusing to help her poor parents. But Fatima had uncovered the evidence of their actual finances, and the record of everything she'd given them under false pretenses. Fatima told me, "They claimed poverty and took money from me for years, while secretly sitting on savings and spending on my sibling. When I found out and stopped, they told everyone I refused to help my poor parents. But I had proof of their actual finances and everything I'd given. The record showed they weren't poor at all. They were just using me." Fatima stopped the support, and her parents' Poverty Act collapsed against their own hidden accounts. The next story came from a man named Kofi, whose entitled parents took the wages he'd sent home for a purpose and spent them elsewhere. Kofi, working abroad, had sent money home for a specific purpose, to build a house for himself, entrusting his parents to manage the construction. Over years he sent a fortune, but when he returned there was no house or a fraction of one, and the money, his parents admitted, had been used for the family, which meant spent on the golden child sibling and their own wants. When Kofi objected, they told the family he was selfish and only cared about his house, not his family. But Kofi had the records of every transfer he'd sent, the amounts, the dates, the stated purpose, against the reality of what had actually been built. Kofi told me, "I sent money home for years to build my house, and they spent it on my sibling and themselves, then called me selfish for asking where it went. But I had every transfer dated with the purpose. The record showed I'd sent a fortune for a house that was never built. The numbers proved where my money really went." Kofi was believed, and his parents' claim that his house money had gone to the family was exposed by his own remittance records. The next story came from a woman named Bianca, whose entitled parents forged her signature to take a loan against her. Bianca's parents, needing money, had forged her signature to take out credit or a loan in her name, or to access an account, betting she'd never find out or never fight her own parents. When the debt surfaced and Bianca confronted them, they minimized, claimed she'd agreed, and told the family she was accusing her parents of a crime over a misunderstanding. But Bianca had the documents, and the signature did not match hers, and she could prove she had never authorized it. Bianca told me, "They forged my signature to take a loan in my name, and when I found out, they said I'd agreed and told everyone I was accusing my own parents of a crime. But the signature wasn't mine and I could prove I never authorized it. The forgery exposed itself. You can't fake someone's signature and call it their agreement." Bianca cleared the fraudulent debt, and her parents' forgery could not survive comparison with her real signature. The next story came from a woman named Esme, whose entitled parents pocketed her wedding gifts. At Esme's wedding, guests gave generous cash gifts to the couple, and Esme's parents, appointing themselves keepers of the money for safekeeping, collected the envelopes and then simply kept a large portion, claiming the gifts had been smaller than expected, or used for wedding costs they had never actually paid. When Esme asked, they told the family she was greedy for questioning her own parents about a little money. But Esme, following the custom of recording who gave what for thank you notes, had a record of the gifts, which far exceeded what her parents admitted to. Esme told me, "They held our wedding gifts for safekeeping and kept a big chunk, claiming they were smaller than expected, then called me greedy for asking. But I'd recorded who gave what for thank you notes. The record showed exactly what was given, far more than they admitted. The gap proved they'd kept it." Esme recovered the couple's gifts, because a documented record made it impossible for her parents to pretend the money had never existed. The next story came from a young woman named Beck, and it's proof you don't have to wait until middle age to stop the cycle, because Beck was 19. Beck's entitled parents lived through her achievements and punished her for her failures, and when Beck earned a scholarship and saved her own money for living expenses, almost $6,000 from working weekends, her parents decided that money was family money, and pressured her to hand it over. When Beck declined, they told the relatives she'd become selfish and college had gone to her head. Then her mother went into Beck's room, found the account information, and attempted to transfer the money to herself. But Beck, careful from the start, had turned on every alert the bank offered. So the instant her mother logged in and moved money, Beck's phone lit up with a time-stamped record. She also had screenshots of every text where her mother demanded the money and threatened her for refusing. Beck told me, "My mom taught me that no one would ever believe me over her. So I made sure I'd never need anyone to. I just needed the receipts." The bank reversed the unauthorized transfer because a 19-year-old savings account is legally her own, and Beck kept her $6,000 and went to college, having learned at 19 what took others decades. The next story came from a man named Julian, whose entitled parents demanded he drop out of school to support the family. When Julian, the reliable child, was on the verge of a life-changing education, his parents pressured him to abandon it, to quit school and work full-time to fund the household and his golden child siblings' pursuits, framing his own education as selfish. When Julian refused to sacrifice his future, they told the family he'd abandoned his struggling parents for his own ambitions. But Julian had the messages, his parents demanding he drop out to fund the family while his sibling was fully supported, and his own reasonable attempts to help without destroying his future. Julian told me, "They wanted me to drop out and work to support them and my sibling, and called me selfish for staying in school. But I had the texts where they demanded I give up my education." The record showed they wanted me to sacrifice my whole future while my sibling got everything. It was never about the family. It was about using me. Julian finished his degree, and the truth of what he'd been asked to give up was preserved in his parents' own words. The next story came from a woman named Camila, whose entitled parents controlled her bank account into adulthood. Camila's parents had insisted on being on her bank account to help her manage money, and used that access well into her adulthood to monitor and take her money, moving funds to themselves and the golden child. And when Camila finally removed them from the account, they told the family she was hiding money and cutting her parents out. But Camila had the transaction history showing her parents moving her money to themselves over years. Camila told me, "They stayed on my bank account into my adult life and used it to take my money, and when I finally removed them, they said I was hiding money and cutting them out. But I had the transaction history showing them moving my money to themselves for years. The record showed who was really taking what. Removing them wasn't hiding. It was protecting myself." Camila secured her finances, and the transaction record exposed the years of quiet withdrawals. The next story came from a man named Idris, whose entitled parents sabotaged his career out of control. Idris had a good job, and his parents, who wanted him dependent and nearby, actually interfered with his work, contacting his workplace, spreading concerns, trying to undermine his professional life so he'd have to return home and rely on them. When Idris confronted them, they told the family he was paranoid and blaming his parents for his own problems. But Idris had evidence of the interference, records of his parents contacting his workplace and the specific damage they'd tried to do. Idris told me, "They actually interfered with my job to make me dependent on them, contacting my workplace, and when I confronted them they said I was paranoid and blaming them for my problems. But I had proof they'd contacted my work and what they'd said. The record showed the sabotage was real. I wasn't paranoid." Idris protected his career, and his parents' interference was documented beyond deniability. The next story came from a woman named Zainab, whose entitled parents claimed she'd abandoned them while they blocked all contact. Zainab's parents, in a bid to control the narrative and the family's sympathy, told everyone that Zainab had abandoned them, never visited, didn't care, when in truth Zainab had tried repeatedly to visit and connect, and her parents had rebuffed and blocked her, so they could play the wronged, abandoned parents. But Zainab had the record of her attempts, the calls, the messages asking to visit, the time she'd reached out and been turned away or ignored. Zainab told me, "They told everyone I abandoned them and never visited, while I was constantly reaching out and being turned away. But I had every call and message where I tried to connect and they rebuffed me. The record showed I fought to stay in their lives, and they pushed me out to play the victim. The truth was the opposite of what they claimed. The family saw who had really done the abandoning, documented in Zainab's own attempts." The next story came from a man named Mateo, whose entitled parents demanded an enormous sacrifice and then vilified him for hesitating. Mateo's parents demanded that he make a life-altering sacrifice for the golden child sibling, and when Mateo, who had already given so much, needed even a moment to consider such an enormous ask, they immediately told the family he had refused to help his own family in crisis and was heartless. But Mateo had the record of everything he'd already given over the years, and the reality of just how extreme the new demand was, and how quickly his hesitation had been weaponized. Mateo told me, They demanded an enormous sacrifice for my sibling, and the second I hesitated, they told everyone I refused to help my family and was heartless. But I had the record of everything I'd already given, and how extreme the new demand was. The truth was I'd given more than anyone, and they turned a moment's hesitation into a betrayal. The family understood, seeing the long record of Mateo's giving against a single hesitation his parents had inflated into treason. The next story came from a woman named Ingrid, whose entitled parents spent an inheritance meant for her children. Ingrid's grandmother had left money specifically for Ingrid's children, her great-grandchildren, entrusted to be passed down. Ingrid's parents, controlling that transfer, drained it for themselves and the golden child. And when Ingrid discovered her own children's inheritance was gone, her parents told the family she was grasping and obsessed with money. But Ingrid had the documentation of what her grandmother had left for the great-grandchildren, and the record of where it had actually gone. Ingrid told me, "My grandmother left money for my kids, and my parents spent it on themselves and my sibling, then called me grasping for asking. But I had proof of what my grandmother left for my children and where it actually went. The record showed they'd spent my kids' inheritance. The documents didn't lie." Ingrid pursued what could be recovered, and her grandmother's intent for the great-grandchildren was proven despite her parents' theft. The next story came from a man named Anselm, whose entitled parents demanded rent for a home he had renovated and paid for. Anselm had, over years, poured his own money into renovating and maintaining a family property he'd been told would be his, and when the time came, his parents, who had contributed nothing, tried to charge him rent to live there or to sell it out from under him, telling the family Anselm was freeloading on the family home. But Anselm had the records of everything he'd invested in the property, the renovations, the maintenance, the payments, all his, and the understanding documented where he could, that it was to be his. Anselm told me, "I paid to renovate and maintain the family home for years, told it would be mine, and then they tried to charge me rent or sell it, calling me a freeloader. But I had the records of everything I'd put into it. The documentation showed I'd invested far more than anyone, and the property was supposed to be mine. The paper showed who really paid." Anselm's investment was proven, and his parents' attempt to charge him for a home he'd built failed against his records. The next story came from a woman named Delphine, whose entitled parents held her own documents hostage. Delphine's parents had kept control of her important documents, her passport, her identification, her records into her adulthood, using them as leverage to control her movements and choices, and when she demanded them back, they told the family she was cutting them out and being dramatic. But Delphine had the record of her requests for her own documents and their refusals, and the clear fact that these were her legal papers. Delphine told me, "They kept my passport and IDs to control me, and when I demanded my own documents they said I was being dramatic and cutting them out. But I had the record of asking for my own legal papers and them refusing. The documents were mine by law. Holding them was the control, not my asking." Delphine recovered her documents, and her parents' use of her own papers as a leash was exposed. The next story came from a man named Raphael, whose entitled parents guilted him into co-signing and then defaulted. Raphael's parents pressured him to co-sign a loan for them, promising faithfully to make every payment, and Raphael, the reliable son, agreed. They then stopped paying, leaving Raphael on the hook for a debt that damaged his credit, and when he confronted them, they told the family he was refusing to help his parents and abandoning them. But Raphael had the co-signing documents and their promises to pay, and the record of the missed payments that had fallen on him. Raphael told me. They begged me to co-sign, promised to pay every cent, then defaulted and left me with the debt, and told everyone I was refusing to help them. But I had the co-signing documents and their promises. The record showed they defaulted, not me, and stuck me with it. The paper proved who actually failed to pay. Raphael dealt with the debt armed with the truth, and his parents' claim that he'd failed them collapsed against the documented default that was theirs. The next story came from a woman named Soledad, whose entitled parents took over the family business she ran. Soledad had built and run the family business for years, doing the work while her parents held nominal ownership, and when it became valuable, her parents pushed her out, claiming it was theirs and that Soledad had just worked there, and told the family Soledad was trying to steal the family business. But Soledad had documented her years of work, her role in building the business's value, and the arrangements that recognized her stake. Soledad told me, "I built and ran the family business for years, and when it was worth something they pushed me out and said I just worked there, that I was stealing the family business. But I had years of records showing what I'd built and my actual stake. The documentation showed I was the one who made it what it was. The paper protected my share." Soledad's contribution was proven, and her parents' attempt to erase the daughter who'd built the business failed against her records. The next story came from a man named Gideon, whose entitled parents claimed he owed them for a wedding he had actually paid for himself. Gideon's parents had hosted his wedding, and afterward claimed he owed them for the enormous cost, demanding repayment and telling the family Gideon was ungrateful for the wedding they'd given him. But Gideon had the records showing that he and his wife had actually paid for the wedding themselves, that his parents' contribution had been minimal or non-existent, despite their claims. Gideon told me, "They claimed they'd paid for my wedding and that I owed them for it, telling everyone I was ungrateful. But I had the records showing my wife and I paid for it ourselves. Their contribution was almost nothing. The receipts showed who actually paid. They couldn't charge me for a wedding I paid for myself." Gideon's records exposed the false debt, and his parents claimed to have funded a wedding they hadn't paid for collapsed against the receipts. The next story came from a woman named Priscilla, whose entitled parents tried to end her relationship to keep her dependent. Priscilla's parents, who wanted her to remain their caretaker and never build her own family, worked to sabotage her relationship, feeding her partner lies, guilting Priscilla, insisting the partner was wrong for her, all to keep her tethered to them. When the couple set boundaries, her parents told the family the partner had stolen Priscilla and turned her against her family. But Priscilla and her partner kept the record, comparing the lies they'd each been told and tracing them to her parents. Priscilla told me, "My parents tried to end my relationship to keep me dependent on them, feeding my partner lies and guilting me. When we set boundaries, they said my partner turned me against them. But we compared notes and kept the messages. Their own words showed they were the ones sabotaging us. The record exposed the campaign. The relationship survived, and the family saw who had really tried to destroy it." The next story came from a man named Ezra, whose entitled parents spent the benefits meant for his care. Ezra had a disability and benefits designated specifically for his care and support, which his parents, as managers of those funds while he was young, diverted for their own use and the golden child's, leaving Ezra without the support meant for him. When Ezra, grown, asked where the benefits had gone, his parents told the family he was ungrateful and obsessed with money. But the benefits, being official, left a record what was received on his behalf and what had actually been spent on his care, which was little. Ezra told me, "The benefits were meant to support my care, and they spent them on themselves and my sibling, then called me ungrateful for asking. But the payments were documented, and so was how little reached me. The record showed where the money really went." Ezra was believed, and his parents' diversion of his support was exposed by the official record. The next story came from a woman named Harriet, whose entitled parents took credit for the childhood she'd sacrificed to give her younger siblings. Harriet had, as a teenager, essentially raised her younger siblings while her parents were absent or neglectful, sacrificing her own youth. Years later, her parents rewrote that history, telling the family that they had been wonderful, devoted parents, and that Harriet was exaggerating and rewriting the past to make herself the hero, erasing the years of care Harriet had actually provided. But Harriet had evidence of the reality, records, accounts from the siblings themselves, documentation of who had actually raised whom. Harriet told me, "I raised my younger siblings while my parents were absent, and years later they rewrote it, telling everyone they were devoted parents and I was exaggerating. But my siblings backed me up and I had evidence of the reality. The record showed who actually raised those kids. They couldn't erase the years I gave." The truth was preserved, and Harriet's stolen childhood was at last acknowledged. The next story came from a man named Cassius, whose entitled parents charged him for holidays and meals in their home. When Cassius visited his parents, they began, astonishingly, charging him for meals and for staying over, itemizing the cost of holidays as though he were a paying guest in the home he'd grown up in, while the golden child siblings stayed free. When Cassius balked, they told the family he was cheap and didn't want to contribute. But Cassius had the record of the charges they'd itemized against him, and the fact that his sibling was never charged. Cassius told me, "They started charging me for meals and holidays in the home I grew up in, itemizing it like a hotel bill, while my sibling stayed free and called me cheap for questioning it. But I had the charges they'd written up. The record showed they were billing me and not my sibling. The itemized bill proved the favoritism. The absurdity, documented, spoke for itself, and Cassius stopped paying to visit his own family." The next story came from a woman named Lucia, whose entitled parents demanded she fund the golden child's wedding. Lucia's parents insisted she pay for a large portion of her siblings' lavish wedding, tens of thousands of dollars, framing it as her duty. And when Lucia, who had received no such support for her own life, declined, they told the family she was refusing to celebrate her own sibling and was bitter and selfish. But Lucia had the record of the demand, and the contrast with everything she'd never been given, and she had never agreed to fund a wedding she couldn't afford. Lucia told me, "They demanded I pay tens of thousands for my sibling's wedding as my duty, and when I said I couldn't, they told everyone I was bitter and refusing to celebrate my sibling. But I had the messages demanding the money. The record showed they expected me to fund a lavish wedding while I'd gotten nothing myself. The demand was the real story." Lucia kept her money, and her parents' framing of her refusal as bitterness collapsed against the outrageous demand in writing. The next story came from a man named Thaddeus, whose entitled parents publicly humiliated him at a family funeral to seize the estate. At the funeral of a relative, Thaddeus's parents, positioning themselves to control the estate, stood up and denounced Thaddeus to the assembled family, claiming he had neglected the deceased and didn't deserve a share, hoping to shame him out of his inheritance in the emotional moment. But Thaddeus had documented his real relationship with and care for the deceased, and the reality that his parents had done little, and he had the deceased's own documented wishes. Thaddeus told me, "At the funeral, my parents denounced me in front of everyone, saying I'd neglected the deceased and didn't deserve anything, to shame me out of my inheritance. But I had the record of the care I'd actually given and the deceased's own wishes. The documentation showed I'd been there and they hadn't. Their public shaming collapsed against the proof. The estate went as the deceased had actually wished, and Thaddeus's parents' graveside ambush failed against the record." The next story came from a woman named Ottilie, whose entitled parents spent her injury settlement. Ottilie had received a settlement after an accident, money intended for her recovery and future needs, and her parents, controlling it while she was young or unwell, spent much of it on themselves and the golden child. When Ottilie recovered enough to ask about the money meant for her care, they told the family she was money-obsessed and accusing her parents. But the settlement was documented, its purpose clear, and the disbursements recorded. Ottilie told me, "The settlement was for my recovery, and they spent it on themselves and my sibling, then called me money-obsessed for asking. But the settlement and every withdrawal were documented. The record showed my recovery money went to them. The paper proved the theft." Ottilie was believed, because a documented settlement cannot be quietly spent without a trace. The next story came from a man named Ambrose, whose entitled parents demanded a large loan for a business that did not exist. Ambrose's parents pressured him for a substantial loan to fund a business opportunity, which turned out to be a fiction, the money going to the golden child and their own spending. When Ambrose asked about the business and the repayment, they told the family he was hounding his parents and distrustful. But Ambrose had the loan documentation and the promises about the business, against the reality that no such business had ever materialized. Ambrose told me, "They took a big loan from me for a business that never existed, spent it on my sibling, then called me distrustful for asking. But I had the loan documents and their claims about the business. The record showed there was no business, and the money went elsewhere. The paper exposed the lie. Ambrose's records revealed the fictional business, and his parents' scheme collapsed." The next story came from a woman named Beatrice, whose entitled parents tried to convince her husband she was after his money to break the marriage. Beatrice's parents, wanting to keep control, told her husband that Beatrice was only after his money and not to be trusted, and told Beatrice lies about her husband, working to poison the marriage from both sides. When the couple caught on and set boundaries, her parents told the family Beatrice's husband had isolated her. But Beatrice and her husband kept the messages and compared notes, exposing the campaign. Beatrice told me, "My parents told my husband I was after his money and told me lies about him, trying to break us up. When we set boundaries, they said he isolated me. but we kept everything and compared notes. Their own words showed they were the ones lying to both of us. The record exposed the whole thing. The marriage held, and the parents' two-sided campaign was documented in their own messages. The next story came from a man named Lorenzo, whose entitled parents guilt him out of a property that was his. Lorenzo owned a property, legally his, and his parents pressured him relentlessly to sign it over to the family, using guilt and obligation, and when he refused, told the family he was hoarding property while the family struggled. But Lorenzo had the deed and the record of the pressure campaign. Lorenzo told me, "They pressured me for months to sign over my property to the family, and when I refused, said I was hoarding it while they struggled. But the deed was mine, and I had the record of their pressure. The paper showed it was mine, and the messages showed they were trying to take it. I didn't have to give up what was legally mine." Lorenzo kept his property, protected by the deed and his refusal to be guilt out of it. The next story came from a woman named Adelaide, whose entitled parents demanded she move back and abandon her life. Adelaide had built a life in another city, and her parents demanded she give it all up, quit her job, leave her home and friends, and move back to serve them, and when she declined, they told the family she'd abandoned her aging parents and chosen strangers over family. But Adelaide had the record of her efforts to stay connected and help from a distance, and her parents' all-or-nothing demand. Adelaide told me, "They demanded I abandon my whole life and move back to serve them, and when I offered to help from a distance instead, they told everyone I abandoned my aging parents. But I had the messages showing my offers and their ultimatum. The record showed they wanted total control and rejected everything short of it. I didn't abandon them. They rejected my help." The family saw the truth, documented in the parents' own demands. The next story came from a man named Silas, whose entitled parents used grandchildren access as a weapon. Silas and his wife set reasonable boundaries with his parents, who had overstepped repeatedly, and his parents retaliated by telling the family that Silas was keeping the grandchildren from them out of cruelty, when in truth they had been offered reasonable, ongoing access and had rejected it because it wasn't total control. But Silas had the record of the boundaries set, kindly and in writing, and the access offered and refused. Silas told me, "We set reasonable boundaries after they overstepped, and they told the family I was keeping the grandchildren from them out of cruelty. But I had the messages showing the kind, reasonable access we offered and that they refused because it wasn't on their terms." The record showed the difference between boundaries and banishment. I hadn't kept the kids from anyone. The family understood, and the parents' grandchild access grievance collapsed against the documented offers. The next story came from a woman named Vivian, whose entitled parents took her tax refund and government support. Vivian's parents, with access to her finances while she was young, took her tax refunds and any government support she received, treating it as family money, and when Vivian, grown, objected and asked where it had gone, they told the family she was greedy and counting pennies against her parents. But Vivian had the records of the refunds and support received, and where the money had actually gone. Vivian told me, "They took my tax refunds and support money for years, and when I asked about it said I was greedy and counting pennies. But I had the records of what I received and where it went. The paper showed it was mine and it went to them. You can't call someone greedy for asking about their own money that you took." Vivian secured her finances, and the record exposed the years of quiet appropriation. The next story came from a man named Bartholomew, whose entitled parents falsely accused him of stealing from them. When Bartholomew set boundaries, his parents, seeking to discredit him and control the family's sympathy, accused him of stealing money and valuables from them, a fabrication, and spread it widely, painting the reliable son as a thief. But Bartholomew could disprove each specific accusation with records of his whereabouts and the actual fate of the stolen items, some of which his parents themselves had. Bartholomew told me, "They accused me of stealing money and valuables to discredit me, and spread it to the whole family. But every specific accusation I could disprove with records, and some of the missing things they had themselves. The proof showed I was no thief, and exposed who really was inventing things." The false accusations collapsed one by one against Bartholomew's records, and his name was cleared. The next story came from a woman named Cordelia, whose entitled parents demanded she pay her siblings legal fees. When the golden child sibling got into legal trouble of their own making, Cordelia's parents demanded she pay the enormous legal fees, framing it as her duty to family. And when Cordelia, who had her own life to fund, declined to bankrupt herself for her siblings' mistakes, they told the family she'd abandoned her brother in his darkest hour. But Cordelia had the record of the demand, and of the many times she'd already helped this sibling, and of how the trouble was entirely the sibling's own doing. Cordelia told me, "They demanded I pay my siblings huge legal fees for trouble he brought on himself, and called me heartless for saying no. But I had the record of everything I'd already given him and the demand itself. The truth was I'd helped again and again, and this was his mess, not mine to bankrupt myself over." Cordelia kept her savings, and the family saw the pattern in the record. The next story came from a man named Percival, whose entitled parents took an inheritance he'd received from another relative. Percival had inherited money from an aunt, left specifically to him, and his parents, viewing all family money as theirs to direct, pressured him to hand it over and, when he refused, told the family he was keeping the family's money to himself. But Percival had the will and documentation showing the aunt had left the money to him specifically. Percival told me, "My aunt left money to me, and my parents demanded it, then told everyone I was hoarding family money. But the will said it was mine from my aunt to me. The document showed exactly whose it was. Their claim had nothing behind it. Percival kept his aunt's gift, and the will settled who it belonged to." The next story came from a woman named Marguerite, whose entitled parents claimed she never sent money while she'd sent a fortune. Marguerite, working abroad, had sent money home faithfully for years to support her parents, and yet her parents told the extended family that Marguerite never sent anything, that she forgot her family, painting the daughter who'd supported them as neglectful. But Marguerite had every transfer, years of remittances, dated, totaling a fortune. Marguerite told me, "I sent money home for years and they told everyone I never sent anything and forgot my family. But I had every single transfer dated, adding up to a fortune. The record showed exactly how much I'd sent. You can't say someone sent nothing when there's years of transfers with their name on them." The family saw the truth, and Marguerite's supposed neglect was disproven by her own remittance history. The next story came from a man named Lysander, whose entitled parents spent money raised for his medical care. When Lysander faced a serious illness, friends and community raised money for his treatment, funds entrusted in part to his parents to manage. And his parents diverted some of it to themselves and the golden child. When Lysander, recovering, found the gap, his parents told the family he was ungrateful and accusing them during a hard time. But the raised funds were documented, what was given and for what, and the treatment costs were documented, and the gap was clear. Lysander told me, "People raised money for my treatment, and my parents kept some of it, then called me ungrateful for asking where it went during my recovery. But the funds and the treatment costs were both documented. The gap showed what they'd taken. The record didn't care how sick I'd been." Lysander was believed, and his parents' diversion of his medical fund was exposed by the documentation. The next story came from a woman named Genoveva, whose entitled parents demanded her work bonus. When Genoveva earned a significant work bonus, her parents somehow learned of it and demanded a large share, treating her earnings as family money, and when she declined, they told the family she was flaunting money and refusing to share her good fortune with her struggling parents. But Genoveva had the record of the demand and the reality that the bonus was hers, earned by her work. Genoveva told me, "I earned a bonus at work, and they demanded a share and called me selfish for keeping my own money, telling everyone I was flaunting it. But I had the demand in writing, and the bonus was mine, earned by me. The record showed they were trying to take my earnings. Keeping what I earned wasn't flaunting." Genoveva kept her bonus, and the demand exposed the entitlement. The next story came from a man named Octavian, whose entitled parents forced him to give up a scholarship. Octavian had earned a scholarship that required relocation or full-time study, and his parents demanded he give it up to stay and work for the family, and when he took it anyway, told the family he'd chosen himself over his family. But Octavian had the messages where they demanded he abandon a scholarship he'd earned. Octavian told me, "They demanded I give up a scholarship I earned to stay and work for the family, and when I took it, said I chose myself over them. But I had the texts where they told me to abandon it. The record showed they wanted me to throw away my own achievement for them. Taking what I earned wasn't choosing myself over family. It was refusing to be used." Octavian used his scholarship, and the record preserved what his parents had tried to make him surrender. The next story came from a woman named Rosalind, whose entitled parents claimed a jointly bought home as solely theirs. Rosalind had bought a home together with her parents, contributing the majority of the money, with an understanding of shared ownership, and when the home became valuable, her parents claimed it was entirely theirs and that Rosalind had just lived there, trying to cut her out and telling the family she was trying to take their home. But Rosalind had the records of her contributions, the majority of the purchase, and the arrangements recognizing her ownership. Rosalind told me, "I bought a home with my parents paying most of it, and when it was worth something they claimed it was all theirs and I just lived there. But I had the records of what I paid, the majority of it, and the ownership arrangement. The paper showed my real stake. They couldn't erase what I'd put in." Rosalind's contribution was proven, and her share protected by the records. The next story came from a man named Fitzgerald, whose entitled parents demanded he fund a lavish anniversary party. Fitzgerald's parents insisted he pay for an extravagant anniversary celebration for themselves, thousands of dollars, framing it as his obligation, and when he declined an expense he couldn't afford, They told the family he wouldn't even celebrate his own parents' marriage and was cold. But Fitzgerald had the record of the demand and the reality of what they'd asked him to spend. Fitzgerald told me, they demanded I pay thousands for a lavish anniversary party for them, and when I said I couldn't afford it, told everyone I wouldn't celebrate my own parents and was cold. But I had the demand in writing. The record showed they expected me to fund an extravagant party I couldn't afford. Saying no wasn't cold. It was honest about my budget. Fitzgerald kept his finances intact, and the demand, documented, spoke for itself. The next story came from a woman named Winifred, whose entitled parents isolated her by lying to her friends. Winifred's parents, seeking to keep her dependent, went beyond the family and contacted her friends, spreading lies about her, trying to damage her friendship so she'd be isolated and have no one but them. When Winifred discovered it, they told the family she was paranoid and imagining things. But Winifred's friends told her what her parents had said, and some forwarded the actual messages. Winifred told me, they went to my friends and spread lies about me to isolate me, and when I found out they said I was paranoid. But my friends told me and some forwarded her messages. Her own words sent to my friends proved what she was doing. I wasn't imagining it. Winifred's friendships held, because the people who loved her saw the lies for what they were, documented in her parents' own hand. The next story came from a man named Reginald, whose entitled parents took his car and called it family property. Reginald had bought a car with his own money, titled in his name, and his parents took it for the golden child's use and refused to return it, claiming it was family property, and telling the family Reginald was selfish for wanting his own car back. But the car was titled in Reginald's name. Reginald told me, they took my car from my sibling and said it was family property, calling me selfish for wanting it back. But the title had my name on it. I bought it with my money. The paper showed it was mine, not the family's. Reginald recovered his car, protected by the title. The next story came from a woman named Millicent, whose entitled parents demanded she support them while openly lavishing everything on the golden child. Millicent's parents pressured her for money constantly, claiming need, while openly and visibly funding the golden child's lifestyle, trips, and luxuries. When Millicent pointed out the contradiction and reduced her support, they told the family she'd abandoned her struggling parents. But Millicent had the record of what she'd given, and the visible evidence of what her parents lavished on the golden child. Millicent told me, they demanded money from me claiming they were struggling, while openly funding my siblings' luxuries. When I pointed it out and pulled back, they said I abandoned my struggling parents. But I had the record of what I gave, and everyone could see what they spent on my sibling. The contradiction was obvious. They weren't struggling. They were choosing. Millicent stopped the one-way support, and the record exposed the favoritism. The next story came from a man named Horatio, whose entitled parents demanded he repay them for the childhood home he'd grown up in. When Horatio set boundaries, his parents presented him with a demand for back rent for the years he'd lived at home as a child and young adult, an invoice for his own upbringing, and told the family he was ungrateful for refusing to pay. But Horatio kept the demand, the written invoice for his childhood, and simply let people see it. Horatio told me, they billed me back rent for growing up in my own childhood home, an invoice for being their kid, and called me ungrateful for refusing. But I kept the bill. All I had to do was show people they'd literally invoice me for my childhood. Nobody sided with them after reading that. The absurd demand in writing discredited itself. The next story came from a woman named Josephine, whose entitled parents guilt her into an inheritance advance that was really a permanent loss. Josephine's parents convinced her to give them a large sum, framed as an advance she'd get back from her inheritance. And then, of course, there was no inheritance, or it was redirected to the golden child, and the advance was simply money taken. When Josephine raised it, they told the family she was counting on an inheritance and greedy. But Josephine had the record of the money she'd given and the promise of the advance against her inheritance. Josephine told me, "They convinced me to give them a big sum as an advance against my inheritance, and then there was no inheritance for me. When I raised it, they called me greedy for counting on an inheritance. But I had the record of what I gave and their promise. The paper showed I'd handed over real money on a promise they never kept." Josephine's records exposed the false advance, and her parents' scheme was laid bare. The next story came from a woman named Arabella, whose entitled parents demanded she cancel her own wedding to save money for the golden child. Arabella was planning her modest wedding when her parents demanded she postpone or shrink it so the money could go toward the golden child's far grander wedding. And when she declined to sacrifice her own day, they told the family she was selfish and putting herself before her sibling. But Arabella had the messages demanding she give up her own wedding for her siblings. Arabella told me, "They wanted me to cancel or shrink my own wedding so the money could go to my sibling's bigger one, and called me selfish for refusing. But I had the text demanding it. The record showed they expected me to sacrifice my own wedding for my siblings. Wanting my own day wasn't selfish." Arabella had her wedding, and the demand exposed the favoritism in writing. The next story came from a man named Constantine, whose entitled parents claimed his professional achievement as their own and demanded he support them lavishly because of it. When Constantine became successful through his own work, his parents suddenly claimed credit for making him who he was, and demanded he now fund a lavish lifestyle for them as repayment. And when he set limits, they told the family he'd forgotten where he came from. But Constantine had the reality of how he'd built his success alone, and the record of the escalating demands. Constantine told me, "When I succeeded, they claimed credit and demanded I fund a lavish lifestyle for them as repayment, and said I'd forgotten where I came from when I set limits. But I'd built it myself, and I had the record of their escalating demands. The truth was they wanted to cash in on my success. Setting limits wasn't forgetting my roots." Constantine kept reasonable boundaries, and the record showed the demands for what they were. The next story came from a woman named Evangeline, whose entitled parents took her belongings and gave them to the golden child. Evangeline had personal belongings, some valuable, some sentimental, that her parents took and gave to the golden child while Evangeline was away, and when she asked for them back, claimed they'd always been shared, and told the family Evangeline was possessive and materialistic. But Evangeline had proof the belongings were hers, records, photographs, gifts documented to her. Evangeline told me, "They took my things and gave them to my sibling, then said they'd always been shared and called me materialistic for wanting them back. But I had proof they were mine, photos and records. The documentation showed whose they were. Wanting my own things back wasn't possessive. Evangeline's ownership was proven, and her parents' redistribution of her belongings was exposed. The next story came from a man named Sebastian, whose entitled parents demanded he sign over his share of a family property. Sebastian had a documented share in a family property, and his parents pressured him relentlessly to sign it over for the golden child's benefit, using every guilt tactic, and when he refused, told the family he was greedy and tearing the family apart over property. But Sebastian had the documentation of his share and the record of the pressure. Sebastian told me, "They pressured me to sign over my share of a family property for my sibling, and called me greedy and divisive when I refused. But I had the documents showing my share was legally mine, and the record of their pressure. The paper showed it was mine to keep. Refusing to give away what was legally mine wasn't tearing the family apart." Sebastian kept his share, protected by the documentation of what was rightfully his. The next story came from a woman named Philippa, whose entitled parents demanded she quit her job to be their full-time unpaid caregiver, while the golden child was excused entirely. As her parents aged, they demanded Philippa give up her career to care for them full-time, unpaid, while the golden child's sibling, who lived nearby and had more freedom, was asked for nothing. When Philippa proposed a fair arrangement, shared care or paid help, they told the family she refused to care for her own parents. But Philippa had the record of the demand, her fair proposals, and the fact that the sibling had been excused entirely. Philippa told me, "They demanded I quit my career to be their unpaid full-time caregiver while my sibling was asked for nothing, and when I proposed sharing the care, said I refused to care for my parents. But I had the messages showing the demand, my fair offers, and that my sibling was excused. The record showed I offered to help fairly, and they wanted me to sacrifice everything alone. Proposing fairness wasn't refusing." Philippa arranged fair care, and the record exposed the lopsided demand. The next story came from a man named Augustus, whose entitled parents claimed his contributions to a family fund as gifts while treating his siblings as loans to be repaid. Augustus had contributed heavily to a shared family fund over years, contributions his parents treated as simply expected, while the golden child's rare contributions were treated as generous loans the family owed back. When the accounting came, his parents claimed Augustus had given nothing worth mentioning, while his sibling was owed repayment. But Augustus had the record of every contribution he'd made to the fund, dwarfing the siblings. Augustus told me, "I contributed heavily to the family fund for years, treated as just expected, while my siblings' rare contributions were treated as loans to repay. When the accounting came, they said I'd given nothing worth mentioning. But I had the record of every contribution. The numbers showed I'd given far more than my sibling. The paper proved who had actually funded the family. Augustus's contributions were proven, and the double standard exposed by the ledger." The last story before we close came from a woman named Genoveva, whose entitled parents took the deposit she'd saved for her own home and gave it to the golden child. Genoveva had saved for years for a down payment on her first home, and her parents, learning of the savings, pressured and guilt her into lending it to the golden child for their home instead, promising repayment. And then, of course, it was never repaid, and Genoveva's dream of her own home was gone. When she asked for her money, They told the family she was putting money over her siblings' happiness. But Genoveva had the record of her savings, the loan, and the promise of repayment. Genoveva told me, "I saved for years for my own home, and they guilt me into lending it to my sibling for theirs, promising repayment that never came. When I asked for it back, they said I was putting money over my siblings' happiness. But I had the record of my savings and the loan and their promise. The paper showed it was my home deposit, given on a promise they broke. My sibling got a home. I got a lie." Genoveva pursued repayment armed with the documentation, and the truth of whose money had bought that home was preserved in the record. Every one of these stories, mine and all the others you've heard tonight, comes down to the same truth about entitled parents, the kind who treat a child not as a person to love but as a resource to use. Their power depends on a single trick, repeated in every one of these stories. They take in private, and they accuse in public. They hide what you give and broadcast what you refuse. They count on your love, your guilt, your lifelong training as the reliable one who never makes a fuss. And they count, above all, on you never laying the actual record on the table. There is a second half to the trick worth naming because it keeps so many of us trapped for so long. Entitled parents almost always run a two-child system. A golden child who receives and a scapegoat child who provides. The golden child is praised no matter what they do, and the scapegoat is blamed no matter what they give. And the cruelest part is that the scapegoat is usually the one who loves the family most, who tries the hardest, who gives the most, precisely because they have spent a lifetime being told that love must be earned through usefulness. So they give and give, hoping this time it will finally be enough. It never comes because the role was assigned before they could walk, and no amount of giving will ever change it. Truly understanding that the game is rigged and cannot be won by playing harder, is the beginning of freedom. And notice what saved every single person in these stories. Not one of them won by being louder than their parents or crueler, or more persuasive in the moment. They won because they had kept the record, the signed loan agreement, the credit report, the will, the gift letter, the bank statements, the deed, the care calendar, the transfers, the messages, created quietly, often without any specific plan, sometimes just out of a habit of honesty, and then produced at the exact moment it was needed, so that the truth could speak for itself. Because a tearful accusation is persuasive right up until someone lays a dated document on the table, and then it is nothing at all. So if you have parents like this, parents who have decided that your money, your credit, your inheritance, your labor, your very name and future belong to them, hear me. Loving your parents does not mean letting them use you. You are allowed to help and still have limits. You are allowed to love them and still refuse to be drained. And you are allowed, when they try to make you the villain, to tell the truth. Keep the records. Track what you give. Save the proof. Not out of coldness and not to keep score for its own sake, but because on the day they try to rewrite your kindness into selfishness, the truth in your hand is the only thing that can turn the whole story around. A tear can be performed. A dated record cannot. Thank you for staying with me through all of these. Mine and Monica's and Priya's and Nadia's and Grace's and Lauren's and Sam's and Ben's and Talia's and Marcus's and Hannah's and Diego's and Rose's and Aisha's and Priyesh's and Omar's and Nina's and Yuki's and Farah's and Sanaa's and Elias's and Layla's and Nia's and Priyanka's and Tom's and Dahlia's and Fatima's and Kofi's and Bianca's and Esme's and Beck's and Julian's and Camila's and Idris's and Zainab's and Mateo's and Ingrid's and Anselm's and Delphine's and Raphael's and Soledad's and Gideon's and Priscilla's and Ezra's and Harriet's and Cassius's and Lucia's and Thaddeus's and Adelie's and Ambrose's and Beatrice's and Lorenzo's and Adelaide's and Silas's and Vivian's and Bartholomew's. If you were the reliable one in your family, quietly holding everyone up while being told you were the selfish one, I hope you know the truth about yourself even if they never say it. You were never the villain. Keep your records, keep your money, keep your dignity, and keep your peace. Take care of yourself and sleep well.